Right, this is the screen. Yeah.
So, good evening, everybody. We have 6 posters that we want to share with you. The first one is presented by Dr. Indraja, first year postgraduate on benign esophageal stricture. Over to you, Indraja.
Yes. Good evening, respected President and Secretary, Surgical Society of Bangalore. To present my poster on benign esophageal stricture.
Please don't waste time in saying no. You can say good evening and start. Okay.
It is an abnormal narrowing of esophageal lumen. It can be benign or malignant. Most of the patient presents with difficulty in swallowing. The incidence of esophageal stricture is around 1.1 per 10,000 person years. This is a case of 34-year-old male with no medical comorbidities, presented with difficulty in swallowing since 2.5 years, initially was solids, then progressed to liquids, and no other significant clinical findings. And barium swallow suggested a severe short segment stricture just above the gastroesophageal junction. And patient underwent balloon dilatation of esophagus 3 times in 6 months of duration because of the patient also underwent self-expanding metabolic.
I think we lost your voice.
Indraja, unmute yourself.
ಮಧ್ಯದಲ್ಲಿ ಬೇರೆಯವರು ಮಾತಾಡಿದಾಗ ಏನಾಗುತ್ತೆ ಮ್ಯೂಟ್ ಆದಾಗ ಇದು ಈ ಸ್ಲ್ಯಾಕ್ ಕ್ರಿಯೇಟ್ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ.
And upper GI endoscopy showed stricture at OG junction, and barium swallow showed stricture above the gastroesophageal junction. When we proceed for exploratory laparotomy, there was stricture high in the mid-esophagus. Hence, decision was made to do transhiatal esophagectomy and cervical esophagogastric anastomosis. And intraoperatively, there was a severe short segment stricture above the gastroesophageal junction, 5 centimeters above the gastroesophageal junction, which was intrathoracic, and there was a dilatation of esophagus throughout the length, including the cervical esophagus proximal to the stricture. And histopathology suggested benign ulceration secondary to gastroesophageal reflux disease. And most of the benign strictures are due to the gastroesophageal reflux, and that can be treated by endoscopic dilatation. And most common cause of the strictures is peptic stricture due to the gastroesophageal reflux disease that accounts for 70 to 80%. And prognosis of the stricture depends upon the timing of evaluation and management and underlying cause of the stricture. Benign strictures, dilatation is the first line management, and in around 10 to 13%, 30% of the patient, there is a chance of restenosis. And stent placement reserved for those patients in whom repeated dilatation is not adequate and symptomatic control is poor. In this case, patient underwent balloon dilatation for 3 times and stent placement, and because of the persistent symptoms, decision was made to operate, and 6 months follow-up period were uneventful, and patient is doing well now. Thank you, sir.
Can I ask you a question, Dr.
Yes,
Rajshekhar? Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Was any biopsy was done prior to surgery? Was it confirmed whether it is benign or malignant?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. It is a benign stricture.
Biopsy was done.
Yes, sir.
Okay. What is the purpose of presenting this as a special case in this?
So, because like most of the benign strictures that can be treated by the balloon dilatation, sir, but even though like patient is underwent balloon dilatation for 3 times, patient have persistent symptoms, and it is a short stricture, sir. And in barium swallow and OGD, the stricture location is different, sir.
Fine. 3 times. Already described.
Can we go on to the next poster?
Anything from Ravi? Okay.
Please stick on to the time. Please go on to the next poster.
3
3 minutes for presentation, 2 minutes for discussion. Any questions you can type in the chat box. Even the answers can be given in the chat box. Thank you.
That's Mark.
Please don't stop sharing the screen. Once your presentation is over, close your when you press escape, you will come out of the presentation mode and close that window, and you will then go to the page which shows the link and then start working. The next person can start working from there. Do not stop sharing, it wastes time. Please go ahead. Ravi, if you're there, can you please announce the name of the candidate and what he is talking about so that he can start? Ravi, are you there?
Yeah. The next poster is an unusual case of a congenital hernia with the ovaries and fallopian tubes as contents. Over to Pavan for this presentation.
Thank you, sir. Good evening, everyone. Today I am going to present on congenital hernia with ovary and fallopian tube as contents. 13-year girl child came to OPD with complaints of swelling in the right inguinal region since 3 to 4 months, associated with pain since 1 month. Vitals are stable on examination. There was no visible swelling, but on coughing, a swelling of size around 3 into 3 centimeters was seen. We diagnosed this as uncomplicated congenital hernia. Relevant blood investigations were done, which were normal. Ultrasound abdomen suggesting of hernia of right ovary in the inguinal canal with multiple follicles and smaller sized uterus for her age. We planned for open herniotomy. In the intraoperative findings, as shown in the image, the hernial sac contains uterus, right ovary, and fallopian tubes as content. This is the proximal part of the fallopian tube, which is continued with the uterus, and this is the distal part of the fallopian tube containing fimbrial end. The middle third of the fallopian tube had mesosalpinx. We followed up the patient for 8 months. She is doing well, and she attained menarche 6 months back. In children, incidence of congenital hernia is only 0.8 to 4.4%, and the exact mechanism by which an ovary slides through the inguinal canal still remains unclear. Congenital anomalies of ovaries and fallopian tubes are rare. Of this, incidence is 0.1 to 0.5%. Partial or complete absence of fallopian tube is very rare occurrence. Gurer conducted a retrospective study between 1989 and 2004 on 1,915 patients who underwent hernia repair, out of which only 7 patients contain ovary and fallopian tube as contents. These are my review. These are my literatures. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Any questions, sir?
Can I ask a question? Yeah.
Yes, sir.
What are the probable complications if you had not done an earlier herniotomy?
Sir, strangulation. Sir.
Strangulation of?
Sir, strangulation of the contents. Sir.
Yeah, that's one of the major this one. That's why urgently it has to be done. Otherwise, ovarian this one, once it is affected, that ovary we may be losing it, even fallopian tube. So urgent surgery is required in all these cases. Yeah. Nice presentation.
Thank you, sir. Any other questions?
Even the gonads can go for torsion, sir. Ovaries can go for torsion.
Yeah, ovaries one. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So the next poster will be a unusual case of primary sternal osteomyelitis, and presenting that is Dr. Janani.
Good evening, everyone. My poster is on primary sternal osteomyelitis, a rare case. Sternal osteomyelitis is a morbid and challenging condition. Primary and secondary sternal osteomyelitis are there. Primary, it is the most common cause is Staphylococcus aureus infection and Pseudomonas aeruginosa infection. Secondary sternal osteomyelitis, most common cause is secondary to post-CABG or median sternotomy. The risk factors include intravenous drug use, diabetes, and obesity. Management plan includes antibiotic therapy with debridement plus or minus soft tissue reconstruction. Mine is a case of 64-year-old male who's a known diabetic presented to us with non-healing ulcer with multiple discharging sinuses over the sternal region for 6 months. He has undergone excision of very carbuncle in 2 months before presenting to us, and also undergone debridement following the first procedure. Routine investigations were normal. Pus culture sensitivity was specific to Pseudomonas aeruginosa infection, and MRI sternum shows sternal osteomyelitis changes here. We proceeded with surgery. On table, we found necrotizing ulcer of 5 into 6 into 2 centimeters with multiple discharging sinuses and also bony sequestrum over the second rib. And we proceeded with excision of infected granulated tissue and bony sequestrum and multiple sinuses. We sent it for histopathology. It turned out to be chronic osteomyelitis. Patient had been on vacuum dressing for 4 cycles for 5 weeks and on regular follow-up. Despite persistent discharge from wound was there. Again, pus culture sensitivity was done in January month, and it turned out to be Pseudomonas aeruginosa infection. And MRI sternum was repeated. It showed osteomyelitis and sequelae. Again, admitted on January month for further management. So we treated the patient with IV antibiotics after admission, and again wound debridement and split skin grafting was planned on January month. And the split skin grafting was taken from right thigh, and this is the pre-op wound, and this is post-op wound, and this is 6 months follow-up wound. So osteomyelitis is one of the most severe complications that arise following operative treatment of wound, and primary sternal osteomyelitis has no contagious focus of infection. Though we can consider carbuncle in this case, the site of carbuncle is mostly at the nape of neck. So we should also suspect primary sternal osteomyelitis in such cases, and it requires systematic management combining appropriate diagnostic studies and appropriate surgical intervention. Hence, I conclude primary sternal osteomyelitis is to be considered in cases with such ulcers in sternal region. It has to be treated with systematic way to achieve successful patient results. Thank you.
Thank you, Janani. Questions from the audience, please. Dr. Rajshekhar, sir.
Yeah. Why do you think there was a recurrence? Was there any, could you make out any reason why you have to do it again?
Sir, in first excision, they did superficial debridement, sir. And they didn't go deep inside the bone. But there was bony sequestrum, which we found out during our procedure. And we have investigated the patient thoroughly, because all the previous procedures were done outside the hospital. And after admission, we investigated thoroughly with MRI and also pus culture sensitivity, sir. So we found out this osteomyelitis changes in the MRI sternum.
So main surgery was done in your hospital for the first time. You have not repeated again.
No, sir. The previous 2 surgeries were done outside.
Fine.
So there is a question. There is a question from Dr. Shrikar, Janani.
Yes, sir.
When you had second, when they got admitted again with the Pseudomonas infection, why did you do split skin grafting?
Sir, after treating the patient for with IV antibiotics for 1 week, the pus discharge has been subsequently reduced, sir. After that only we planned split skin grafting.
Correct. Okay. Any other questions from the audience? Okay. Thank you, Janani.
Thank you, sir.
The next poster. The next poster is esophageal GIST tumor, rare malignancy by Hari Arasan. Over to you, Hari.
Thank you, sir. Very good evening to one and all. Today I'll be presenting my poster on topic esophageal gastrointestinal stromal tumor, just a rare malignancy. So GIST often arise in stomach and small intestine, while esophageal GISTs are rare. Due to this rarity, the clinico-pathological data on this esophageal GIST is extremely limited, and so the surgical management. This is a case of a 64-year-old male came with complaints of difficulty in swallowing since 6 months, and it got worsened in the last 1 month. He also had a history of loss of weight. So he did endoscopy, underwent endoscopy elsewhere, which showed lower end of esophagus sessile polyp with smooth surface, suggestive of possible submucous lipoma. He also underwent CCT chest and abdomen, which showed mass in the lower esophagus with a posterior lateral left lateral wall of size 9 and 5 into 4 centimeter approximately. It was extending to the abdomen extraabdominally through esophageal hiatus, causing mass effect suggestive of esophageal leiomyoma. So we made a diagnosis of gas-esophageal junction mass for possibly GIST and planned for surgery, laparoscopic assisted enucleation or excision plus proceed. Intraoperatively found that the G junction tumor extending till stomach was size 18 to 4 centimeter. But as the tumor was seen in the posterolateral aspect and also the upper end of the tumor was not visualized, it was converted to laparotomy. And it was found that the G junction tumor extending till the posterior wall of stomach below and above till the mid esophagus of size 12 into 5 centimeter approximately. Hence, transhiatal esophagectomy was done with feeding jejunostomy. Postoperatively, patient had left hydropneumothorax and ICD was inserted. Patient was started on feeds and postoperative day 8, patient got discharged in a stable condition. Histopathology was found to be gastrointestinal stromal tumor of spindle cell type and tumor size of 10 into 403 centimeter approximately with mitotic rate greater than 5 per 50 high power field. And immunohistochemistry also showed that CD117 and DOG1 positive and shows response to tyrosine kinase inhibitor. Hence, he was started on imatinib treatment. Post of 3rd month, patient had difficulty in swallowing solid foods, and so endoscopy was done, which showed no narrowing of any esophageal anastomosis. Similar complaints post of 10 months, he presented to us, which showed endoscopy, anastomotic stricture, and hence balloon dilatation was done. Currently, post-operative 1 year, patient is doing well without any complaints. As we know, the esophageal GIST were extremely uncommon, which is 0.7% of all the GIST, and the poor survival, 2 important factors contribute to is tumor size and mitotic rate of the tumor. Pence et al. In a study showed that the average size of the GIST at the time of resection was approximately 12 centimeter, and also showed that higher the mitotic rates, poor is a 5-year disease-free survival. And patients with esophageal GIST measuring 5 centimeter or smaller may be safely treated with esophageal enucleation. However, regarding the biopsy, NCCN guidelines do not suggest any preoperative biopsy of the resected mass because of high risk of bleeding or tumor rupture. And regarding the adjuvant treatment, imatinib, which can be used as a neoadjuvant or adjuvant, has led to a significant increase in the median survival of patients with advanced GIST. However, no clear consensus about the optimal treatment of this disease because of this rarity. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Well done, Hari. Dr. Rajshekhar, sir.
Nothing, very well done. No questions from my side.
Thank you.
Any questions from the audience? Okay. So if there are no questions, we'll move to the next poster, which is a rare case of bilateral pneumatocoel in a post-COVID patient. Ajit Darandale.
Good evening, everyone. I'm presenting my poster on a rare case of bilateral pneumatocoel in post-COVID patient. Our patient is a 33-year-old gentleman, non-smoker with no comorbidities. He was admitted with COVID pneumonia on 12th of April at another hospital. A CT was done, which showed bilateral ground glass opacities. He was treated in the wards and discharged on 29th April. On 3rd May, he developed left-sided acute chest pain, for which he was evaluated with a CT. Left pneumothorax was noted along with incidental finding of bilateral pneumatocoel. For this, ICD was inserted and he recovered well and discharged within a week. On 24th May, he again developed breathlessness with multiple episodes of hemoptysis, for which a CT was done, which showed a large 15 into 12 centimeter air-filled mass. We were not sure whether it was a pneumatocoel or loculated pneumothorax. So we inserted a pigtail catheter. However, the patient did not improve and his oxygen saturation dropped with oxygen requirement going as high as 6 liters per minute. So we decided to operate on him. Bronchoscopy was done, which showed blood-stained secretions in right lower lobe bronchus with no active bleeding. We did a right thoracoscopy, which showed a large pneumatocyst compressing on the entire right lung. The pneumatocyst was punctured and excised along with multiple bronchopleural fistulae. Here we can see a completely collapsed right lung. We also inserted left ICD prophylactically. This is the post-operative specimen showing pneumatocyst and multiple bronchopleural fistulae. Post-operatively, patient did well and was discharged with home oxygen of 2 liters per minute. Histopathology confirmed our diagnosis. On follow-up of 45 months, patient is doing well. CT scan, which we had repeated recently, is normal, and there is complete resolution of left pneumatocyst. There are very few cases in literature of post-COVID pneumatocyst. However, in none of them, active surgical intervention was done. Pneumatocysts are air-filled thin-walled cystic lesions in lung that develop commonly after infection or trauma, positive pressure ventilation. When the pneumatocyst ruptures, it can lead to pneumothorax, and surgeons and physicians should be aware of this, and careful follow-ups of patients is required. We are presenting this case because this is the first case in literature which required active surgical intervention for post-COVID pneumatocyst. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Ajit. Dr. Rajshekhar, sir.
No questions. A good presentation and a really rare case. Well done.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Any other questions in the chat
we will
box?
need to ask some questions to evaluate the student. Please, audience, we are the host institution, so we cannot ask questions. Kindly, audience, judges, please ask questions so that one aspect of their assessment is on the way in which they answer questions. Please.
Yeah.
So there are 2 questions in the chat box, sir. Indications for intervention by Guru Shantapa sir, and Naz ma'am is asking what is the difference between bulla and pneumatocyst.
Yeah. Okay. Ajit, what are the indications for surgery in pneumatocyst?
Sir, pneumatocyst, in literature, they have given if the size is more than 50% of the hemithorax, or there are complications like multiple bronchopleural fistulae or bleeding or pneumothorax, then we can go in for surgery, sir.
Okay. And
sir, in this,
the difference between bulle and pneumatocyst.
Sir, bulle will be thin walled, sir. This is little thick walled, sir. Pneumatocyst.
If I may answer.
Both be the same size? Bulle and pneumatocyst will both.
No, sir. Pneumatocyst will be large in size and it can continue growing in size, sir, which is also a surgical indication.
Okay.
For getting the knowledge, can we get Rajshekhar Reddy to answer that, please?
Yeah. Rajshekhar?
Pneumatocyst is like following trauma. You see thin, thick-walled cystic lesions and following positive pressure ventilation. Those are called pneumatocysts. If a patient primarily comes with a pneumothorax and you see thin-walled on the periphery of the lung, those are bulle. The pneumatocysts will be in the central part of the lung. Okay. In this patient, it had to be up. We were not sure whether it was a loculated pneumothorax or a pneumatocyst which is becoming bigger in size. And his oxygen requirement was going up from 2 liters to 4 liters to 6 liters. In fact, we suggested him to come for surgery after 6 weeks from the COVID treatment. We all know from the literature, whatever little evidence, when you operate after 6 weeks, the morbidity and mortality is much less. But we could not wait for that long, because his oxygen requirement went up to 6 liters. Since I was not sure whether it was a loculated pneumothorax or a pneumatocyst, we put an ICD, hoping that if it's a pneumothorax, the air will come out and the lung will expand. That's where you see another CT scan done after the tube being inserted. But the size of the pneumatocyst remained the same almost, and hence we had to operate him. Moment we took out the pneumatocyst, his oxygen requirement came down to 2 liters, and within a week, he was off oxygen. It was a gradual stepwise decision to operate, not a direct decision. It was a tough decision to make to operate on this patient. And the left pneumatocyst has resolved completely on its own. Right lung, fortunately, looks completely normal in the 1 month following, 45 days following the surgery. in the CT scan. Thank you.
Well done, Rajshekar.
Reddy sir, you can answer one more question. What if there is a branchopleural fistula? You can answer in the chat box. There is one more also.
There were multiple.
It's okay. We'll go to the last
bronchopleural
poster.
fistulas.
You can answer in the chat box. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you.
Ajit, let's go to the last poster, which is a case of ovarian dysgerminoma, atypical presentation. Saurabh Majumdar. Go ahead, yours, Saurabh.
Yes, sir. So am I audible, sir?
Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. My poster is a case of an ovarian dysgerminoma with atypical presentation. A 11-year-old female came to the OPD with complaints of mild pain in the abdomen with abdominal distension since 1 week. There was associated fever and nausea without vomiting and an increased urinary frequency. She had attained her menarche 2 years ago and her cycles were regular. On examination, there was a firm mass which was palpable 4 centimeters above the pubis. The lower margins were not felt and there was no palpable lymph nodes. USG of the abdomen and pelvis was done, which showed a large, well-defined lobulated solid hypoechoic lesion of size 11 into 8 centimeters in the hypogastrium with color Doppler showing diffuse vascularity. Uterus was normal and no gestational sac was seen. The MRI of the abdomen had mentioned similar findings, and the mass was closely abutting the uterus and the urinary bladder with non-visualized ovaries. The features were suggestive of a germ cell tumor had all been smartly raised, and in view of this, the surgery was planned. She underwent exploratory laparotomy, excision of the left ovarian tumor, left salpingectomy with omental and right ovarian biopsy. Incision was the lower midline, and the findings was a huge bosselated heart tumor arising from the left ovary. The uterus and the right-sided ovary was normal. There was no peritoneal disease, minimal ascites, and no lymph node enlargement. Histopathology mentioned round to polygonal cells arranged in sheets separated by fibrous septa, giving a lobulated appearance. Lymph node and omentum was free of tumor. Peritoneal fluid was positive for malignant cells. The impression was query a dysgerminoma or a mixed germ cell tumor in view of preoperative raised tumor markers. The slide was sent outside for review, which along with the immunohistochemistry had confirmed the diagnosis of dysgerminoma. 1 week post-operatively, we repeated the tumor markers and all had drastically reduced in quantity. The patient was referred to medical oncologist where she had received 4 cycles of chemotherapy with PEP regimen, following which an ultrasound was done, which showed complete resolution of the disease. Malignant germ cell tumors are rare and comprise less than 5% of all ovarian tumors. The most common malignant germ cell tumor being a dysgerminoma occurs in the median age group of 16 to 20 years. 10% of the cases can occur in the first decade of life. Tumor markers are important and increasingly being used in monitoring clinical status, however, can present a confusing picture as seen in our case. Dysgerminomas are associated with elevations of LDH and less commonly with serum beta HCG. Elevations of AFP are extremely rare and most commonly associated with mixed germ cell or yolk sac tumor. In our cases, all the tumors markers were extremely raised, which is rare. Current standard management protocol is complete cytoreductive surgery followed by adjuvant chemotherapy with a 5-year survival rate exceeding 90% in stage 1 disease. The reproductive outcome of young dysgerminoma survivors are promising with fertility sparing treatment. So I would like to conclude that ovarian dysgerminoma should be included in a differential for young female with lower abdominal pain and mass with raised beta HCG. And since most of them are diagnosed at a young age, the aim should be targeted at fertility sparing treatment. Thank you, sir.
Good. Well done, Saurabh.
Yes,
Questions from the audience and the judge, please.
Ravi Shankar sir, it's a request. I think we are running out of time.
Yeah. Okay.
They put it in the chat box.
Yeah. So
There's a formal
Was the
inauguration.
gynecologist involved in this?
No, sir. Sir, our doctor is a surgical oncologist, and he's very well trained in these management procedures. So he went ahead with the surgery. We did put a reference for a gynecologist, but surgery was done by us.
Okay. Preoperatively, was it diagnosed as an ovarian tumor?
Sir, actually, on examination, there was a large palpable lump involving the lower abdomen, and when we had done for the imaging was suggestive of malignancy only. So, in view of that, we had opted for all the tumor markers, which were all raised. In view of this confusing rising of tumor marker, we decided to go ahead with surgery and post-operatively biopsy, as I told you.
What happened to the markers post-operatively?
Sir, all the markers had drastically reduced in quantity.
What time?
Yes, sir. All of them had reduced in quantity. Although
by what time?
So within 1 week of surgery, sir.
Generally, it is done 2 weeks around after surgery.
Yes, sir. But in our case, we had done it after 1 week, and within that week only, they had reduced drastically only, sir.
Okay. Right. So that brings us to the end of all the poster presentation. Thank you, Dr. Rajshekhar, for